Professor Paul Warmington is one of the UK's leading scholars in the sociology of race and education. His latest book, Permanent Racism, Race, Class and the Myth of Postracial Britain, exposes the doublespeak behind the racism has no place in our society narrative, bringing critical race theory and Black Atlantic thought to bear on race equality in the UK. Paul Warmington is visiting professor at Coventry University and visiting research fellow at Goldsmiths University of London, and is with me today to talk about his new book. Paul, welcome to Transforming Society.
Hi, Rebecca. How nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. Thanks so much. Well, let's dive in straight away. So the permanence of racism, from which the title of your book is derived, is a condition of society that was identified by Professor Derek Bell back in the 80s, one of the founders of critical race theory. So I wondered if you could start us off by explaining a little more about this unfolding story of permanent racism, what's meant by the term, and why it's as important to understand today as it was back in the 80s when Derek Bell first coined the phrase.
Sure. The title of my book is Permanent Racism, Race, Class and the Myth of Postracial Britain. And the title Permanent Racism was important to me because I wanted readers to kind of respond with the same initial double take, almost cognitive dissonance that I experienced when I first encountered Derek Bell's book, which is called Faces at the Bottom of the Well: The Permanence of Racism. So it's a book that Bell published in 1992. Right. And it's really one of the key statements in critical race theory. And it was really the subtitle, The Permanence of Racism, that kind of made me sort of take a step back. Because I think for those of us who work in anti-racist circles, the basis of our work has always been this idea, we shall overcome. And the idea that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice and so forth. So there's always this idea that if you're an anti-racist, you're kind of moving towards this shining city on a hill where racism has been overcome decisively. And so I thought, well, what does this guy Derek Bell mean by talking about the permanence of racism? Surely he can't really mean that. And of course, in one sense, Derek Bell did mean it. Derek Bell described his thought as racial realism. And to understand that, it's important to understand where Derek Bell was coming from. He come through the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s in the USA. He was a civil rights lawyer and a legal scholar. And therefore, Derek Bell's founding question was, well, why after decades of civil rights legislation and equalities legislation do racial inequalities and racial injustice still persist in our society? And it was really a kind of rephrasing of Frantz Fanon's great question. Frantz Fanon used to talk about the fact that Western society had developed all the tools of political philosophy, of science and social science and ethics, which should have overcome the great problem of racism. But Fanon said, well, somehow, the modern world has failed to do that. And Derek Bell was kind of rephrasing that idea in his own setting. And Bell's conclusion as to why racial injustice persists was simply that we all like to talk about race as a social construction, but what does that mean? And for me and for Bell, what race is, what racism is it's a political tool. It's a tool for structuring and ordering society. And what Bell said was, well, the reason that racism persists is just that as a tool for ordering and structuring society, it's just too useful. It's just too effective. It's ordered societies across the globe. And obviously, Bell had grown up in a world of segregation in the USA. We had apartheid in South Africa. We had the politer forms of what was once known as the colour bar in the UK. And we have Britain and for that matter, France's and Spain's and Belgium's histories of colonialism. Racism was too valuable a tool for ordering society and stabilizing a society for it to be relinquished anytime soon. So what Bell was saying was, look, he didn't claim to have a crystal ball. What Bell was saying was, look, it may or may not be that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but for our practical purposes, as people trying to combat racism, it's best to bracket all of that. And given what we know and what we know about the last few hundred years of Western society, then it's really best for us to regard racism as a permanent feature of the societies that we live in, particularly those societies that have grown out of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. So there was a kind of paradox there that Bell was offering. He said, no, if you're really committed to combating racism, then accept it as permanent for our purposes. And Bell wasn't, sorry.
He uses that term, doesn't he? That he's using the term as a prescriptive. Is that right? Yeah. Not a descriptive. So
no. It's the other way around. But you're right. That's really important. Yeah. What Bell said was, when I talk about the permanence of racism, I'm talking about it as a descriptive term. In other words, I'm describing the way things are, not as a prescriptive term. I'm not saying that racism should be permanent. I'm saying that in the societies that we have built, it seems to be an embedded element, an embedded tool, cultural tool, political tool within those societies. And Bell wasn't saying that nothing ever changes. He wasn't saying there are never any improvements. But what he was saying was that positional gains in legislation, in policy, in educational achievement, in employment figures, they're positional gains, but they don't mean that racism actually disappears as an axis of conflict in our society. So Bell wasn't saying that we should do nothing. In fact, he was saying quite the reverse. But what he was saying is that our societies are really subject to a constant cycle of progress and then regression as regards the struggle against racism. So that cycle of progress and regression is what he was talking about by using that phrase, the permanence of racism.
Which I suppose speaks to this notion of why it's just as important that we're talking about it, that it's coming under highlight again now through your book as it was in the 1980s, because there is still this cycle continues to exist, the progression and reversal and regression.
That's right, and in the book, I mean, I identify moments in contemporary British society in which I think we can see that cycle of progress and regression happening. So again, at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, you had the Macpherson report into police handling of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And, for a moment, that, again, we were told that it was a turning point, a kind of never again moment as regards the way in which our society will address racism. But really, within a few years of the Macpherson report, you began to see a backlash in our institutions, in policing, in education, in government. And again, those never again moments are a really important notion in critical race theory also that Bell was pointing to. Bell said that he talked about, he used a concept that he called contradiction closure. And by contradiction closure, what Bell meant were these moments in policy or legislation where we are told just that we've reached a turning point, that our attitudes to race and racism have changed fundamentally and forever. These never again moments, we'll never again see the Metropolitan Police handling a case in the way that they handled the murder of Stephen Lawrence, for instance. We'll never again see institutional discrimination, whether it's institutional racism or institutional homophobia or institutional misogyny, take root in our institutions in the way that we saw it in previous decades. And what Bell said was, societies tend to kind of take those moments, governments take those moments, and they present them as moments of contradiction closure, where basically we've dealt with it, it's done with. Basically, we've dealt with the race problem. It's over now. And, I've pointed out moments like that in the book. And again, I suppose key, if you like, the kind of key context of the book is probably the moment between the resurgence of Black Lives Matter as a movement following the police killing in the States of George Floyd. There was a global resurgence in the Black Lives Matter movement. And, in the immediate aftermath of that, we saw, our major institutions, professing their affinity with Black Lives Matter. We saw politicians and major figures taking the knee and, using the black square on social media and all of this stuff. And yet, what my book argues is that was really quite a short window within our public arena. It really wasn't long at all before there was a major pushback against Black Lives Matter and against the kind of consciousness about racial injustice that had emerged in many quarters out of Black Lives Matter. So those cycles are still with us, the cycles that Bell talked about and understood in terms of the permanence of racism.
I mean, there was a sense of which I think you sort of talked to, a sense of a distancing. Oh, well, that's America. And so, you know, there's a sense of Britain is somehow exceptional in terms of its racist, non-racist situation. Which is
I think that there's a tremendous, very powerful British exceptionalism when it comes to issues of race and racism. So, I mean, we can see this constantly. In Britain, we're always more at ease with pointing the finger across the Atlantic and saying, well, gosh, you know, look at those look at those American cops, look at those American politicians, look at Donald Trump, you know, they simply aren't as civilized as us, you know, their racism is far worse than our racism. And you can see this, you know, every month when you know, kids have, and other organizations, have Black History Month, you know, and just how often Black History Month is a kind of listing of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and other figures from the USA. And again, you know, there were mass demonstrations in this country, you know, quite rightly so, following the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. But there have been numerous deaths at the hands of the police, you know, deaths of Black men in particular, at the hands of the police in this country. And there have been for decades, and there have been a number of very high-profile instances. You know, the killing of Dalian Atkinson, a former Aston Villa footballer, in Birmingham, you know, where I live. And yet these instances, you know, they've been bemoaned to an extent, you know, but they're never quite treated in the same way that we treat similar events, terrible events happening in the USA.
Yes. I mean, this sort of speaks to this. So we've got this sort of modern rhetoric that are referred to, but in the introduction, that we live in this, and is in your title, that we live in post-racial Britain, one in which racism has no place. And I really think it would be useful to, you know, go a bit further in thinking about how that notion of post-racialism is used to prematurely close out these uncomfortable conversations about racism, because, you know, it is still very much lived and experienced in everyday society, and yet the narrative suggests otherwise. This post-racial narrative suggests otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the dominant post-racial narrative suggests otherwise, and the post-racial narrative is very much, as you say, about closing off difficult conversations and closing off the possibilities for action against racism. So what is post-racialism about? The first thing I'd say about post-racialism is I think what we're seeing currently in the UK actually is rooted in a much longer, more strongly held desire for what Hazel Carby, one of the great sort of cultural theorists, cultural studies people who worked with Stuart Hall and so forth. Hazel Carby talked about Britain's desire for a conclusive end to these problems of race and racism. And I think that's kind of underlying a lot of what I talk about when I talk about what I call state post-racialism. But I'll just tell you what I think of perhaps two other really important underlying strands within this post-racialism that we see. I mean, one, I suppose, if one wanted to be most generous, there is a kind of well-meant version of post-racialism, which I guess is rooted in what's often termed not as anti-racism, but as non-racism. Right. And non-racism is really, to put it crudely, is not so much about actually combating racism as just not being racist, you know, ourselves at a kind of individual level, and also an institutional level. And yeah, it's rooted in an understandable kind of abstract rationale, which is that really we can see the damage that racism has done to our world, to our societies in the past, and therefore one argument about how to actually take society forward is, you know, to ensure that no community, no group of people are either disadvantaged or advantaged by prescriptive categories over which they have no say, you know, race and and for that matter, gender and sexuality and disability and so forth. So the idea of non-racism is very much that you have equal treatment before the law, that you have equal treatment by our institutions, policing, education, health, and so forth. And again, there's in one sense, we probably all agree that there's yes, we do kind of want equal treatment, but that tends to retreat into a kind of formalism, which says, look, we have a formula here. Let's not really talk about people or communities in terms of race at all. Let's just kind of regard everyone as non-racial blanks, and that will somehow actually produce equality and fairness. And this goes back to Derek Bell also. Bell was very, very, as a legal scholar, was very, very skeptical about these formalist ideas, which said basically, look, if you apply the correct abstract formula to the workings of the law, the workings of social policy, the workings of government, then everything will be fine. Because for Bell and for me, that's a very, very ahistorical position. What it doesn't do is take account of the fact that we don't live on a level playing field. Inequalities are already there, and just this non-racism, non-racialism, this kind of unseeing of race in itself doesn't actually give us a clue as to how to address the inequalities that persist. So that's that.
It silences them. It just silences them.
Absolutely. And if one wanted to be generous, we could say that, well, there is something well meant about some iterations about non-racism. It's based on this abstract liberal principle of equal or same treatment. Yeah. But then you have, I think, a more bad faith version, which I call, and which scholars such as Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Cheryl Harris and Kimberly Crenshaw have talked about as colourblindness or colourblind racism, which really is kind of wanting us to push towards the belief that that racism really isn't there at all. In other words, this kind of iteration of post-racialism, this colourblindness, basically says, look, race and racism, have declined in their social salience. They're just not really important, not as important as they were. And therefore, race is no longer a valid lens through which to view society, either sociologically or in terms of social policy or politics. And, this colorblindness, it doesn't literally argue that there is no racism at all. But what it does is to discount ideas about structural racism and institutional racism. So in a way, it can see that racism might exist in the minds of some bad apples at the individual level. But what it won't do is to countenance the idea that actually our major institutions, housing and health and education and policing and government, actually also serve to reproduce racial inequalities and racial injustices.
You used this term ahistorical, didn't you? And it is that sense that the level playing field exists because whatever we say today is the truth. It sort of misses this notion where we are today is a product
of right.
And that is as true of individuals as it is of systems and institutions.
That's right.
Didn't emerge out of, today's edict on how we feel about things. They emerged out of a history which was deeply and intentionally racist in how it was operated.
Yes, but absolutely. But there is this belief that you can just impose a kind of complete historical break and start again. It's almost a kind of religious belief, that we a millenarian belief, that we've entered a new age now. Yes. All that stuff, and I think that's a very, very important idea that's contained within post-racialism, or a facile kind of post-racialism, as I call it, and I'll tell you why I call it that in a moment. But there very much is the idea that such racism as exists at all is very much a holdover, a dying remnant from a darker, less enlightened age. Therefore, it's really external to our society. It's brought in by the odd bad apple or the odd dark memory here and there. It's not really something that exists and is reproduced in the present. But this kind of colourblindism, it does a couple of things. One is it tends to work, and we find this in policy again and again. We find it in some areas of research. What it tends to do, because we know there are still racialized inequalities between communities, they have to be explained, but explained in ways that owe nothing to ideas about institutional racism or structural racism. So therefore, what we look for is anything but racism to account for racialized inequalities. So therefore, what you get a couple of things. One is you get this search for non-racial factors. So there are certain forms of I don't know of regression analysis that you see in social science and in monitoring and so forth. And I'm not kind of discounting the usefulness of regression analysis altogether, but what you see is these attempts to say, well, actually, it appears that these inequalities are racialized, but actually things like previous parental education or housing or regionality are actually more important than race. And you think, well, it's a complete misunderstanding of how racism works, because there's nothing actually wrong with looking at parental education or previous education to explain the educational attainment of particular communities.
This coming round to intersectionality. So this idea that it's all the factors, including racism, not excluding racism.
The problem is that you can look at parental education, but parental education was already shaped by racism.
Yes.
And you can look at university graduates and say, well, let's look at their previous school education. That's fine, but that previous education was also shaped by racism. And affluence and employment, they're also shaped by they don't exist apart from it. So you get this searching around for things that are supposedly non-racial factors. So we're supposed to see racial inequalities as entirely non-racial, And the other thing, of course, which kind of comes out of that is because even the colourblind thinkers know there are still racialized inequalities in society, what you very often have, therefore, is this kind of inevitable retreat into cultural deficit theories.
Right.
By which I mean that, you get this argument that it's certainly not about institutional racism or structural racism, because we don't really accept the existence of those things. So if this community or that community is having poor outcomes in terms of employment or education or the criminal justice system, then maybe it's something to do with their particular culture, with their family structures and I don't know and their family structures and their ethics and their cultural practices. And so you go back to this whole kind of community blaming, which is this
because we're not racist. When that's none of those things are racist to talk to.
Absolutely. So this is where we kind of move into the post-racial framework here. So what you actually have is the kind of I talk about this this non-racism and this colourblindism as producing a kind of facile post-racialism, because there are very interesting and important challenging ideas about post-racialism and the possibilities of post-racial societies and identities. And you can see this. You see it in the work of, I don't know, Anthony Appiah or Paul Gilroy or Ruth Wilson Gilmore. They explore some of these ideas in very exciting, challenging, almost futuristic ways. But the post-racialism that we have currently is not that at all. It's really not about removing or combating racism so much as it is about just discouraging people from talking about racism at all, from discouraging any talk of race and racism.
Facile post-racism.
Yeah, that's exactly. So I call it facile. It's easy, it's kind of bland, and it's just premature. Yeah. You don't need to look at my book to look at the many examples that have come out of recent reports. The Louise Case's report from this year, 2023, into metropolitan police practices, and you had the Lamy report on the legal system, and you had the race equality audit of racial disparity audit of 2018. You've had masses and masses of reports that just kind of sit on shelves that tell us about racialized inequalities in Britain and the role of racism, institutional racism within them. They're currently sitting on a shelf somewhere, in the Home Office or wherever. So therefore, this I call it facile racism because it's just so self-evidently premature. But the other phrase I use, as I said, that this facile racism, this facile post-racism, this facile post-racialism has become the basis of what I now call a state-led post-racialism.
Right.
So for me, it's now not accidental, it's not incidental. What we're seeing, again and again, is government rhetoric that constantly encourages us to move on from talking about race and racism. In the book, for instance, I talk about how quickly after the Black Lives Matter resurgence of 2020, you saw government rhetoric and government policy, an example being the CRED report, which is a report produced in 2021 by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. Sorry, I often get the exact name. Yes. I just call it the CRED report, but people will know what I'm referring to, which really was initially commissioned as a response to Black Lives Matter and a response to the events of 2020, but really ended up foregrounding a complete dismissal of institutional racism, which it said really is an inflated concept that we shouldn't really be applying in policy.
And doesn't really exist was what it came up with.
No, that's right. And it wasn't just the CRED report. You had reports soon after from the House of Commons Education Committee, again, which became obsessed with the idea that white ideas about white privilege were being kind of taught across the school system, and that this was a cause of underachievement amongst white working class children. And you have many similar kinds of arguments, but and in one sense that there was nothing absolutely new about this. I mean, I remember a decade earlier, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he talked about the need to turn the page on the failed policies of multiculturalism. But there's no doubt that when the CRED report came out, Boris Johnson was Prime Minister at the time, and he trailed the CRED report by saying that that his intention was to change the narrative on race.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
We came to understand exactly what it meant, which was this kind of discounting of institutional racism, and again, this casting of anti-racism as a bogus and divisive thing. And critical race theory, again, is one of the kind of empty signifiers that's often kind of thrown up, to sort of disparage any kind of anti-racist activity. So, not long before the CRED report came out, an equalities minister stood up in the House of Commons and talked about critical race theory, and actually said, this government is unequivocally against critical race theory. And people like myself, who've been working with critical race theory for the previous, 15 years or whatever, just thought, what? No one's ever heard critical race theory referred to in the House of Commons before, and yet apparently it now has captured every institution in the country. This is, but again, it wasn't a real reference to critical race theory as it exists. I mean, it was just a usage of critical race theory as a signifier for any kind of talk of race or racism. And so we need to be unequivocally opposed to critical race theory. Really, it's a way of saying, well, you need to stop talking about race and racism. So I actually say that we've reached a stage now of state-led or state postracialism, and it's very much a backlash against, I suppose, what I often call the state multiculturalism that we saw in the 1980s and the 1990s in Britain. The London Education Authority and the GLC and all the work that they were doing, and work that was done in many local authorities around multiculturalism and anti-racism. We got to the early 2000s and the retreat began, and that retreat needed to be reinforced after 2020 and Black Lives Matter. Hence, we kind of get to this stage of state post-racialism.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about this. There is a desire, you called it contradiction closure. And I think somewhere along there as well is that sense of, I think you write about this idea that sort of don't come to us with racist problems unless you're coming with a fix as well. And what critical race theory, as I understand it, and what permanent racism does is it defies that sort of sense of there's a fix. Here's the 10-point agenda that we now need to follow in order to then put that to bed and say that's all done with.
Yeah, and I think, of course, if we're to be generous, of course, we can understand to an extent the search for practical strategies and so forth, but they're very often they also become kind of forces by which to regulate anti-racism, to regulate talk about racism. So the phrase that you refer to, it's a quote from Frank Wilderson, who terms himself as an Afro pessimist, which is several steps along the road, even from critical race theory. So people who kind of balk at critical race theory, I don't know what they do if they ever actually came across Afro pessimism. But anyway, to cut a long story short, what the quote that I take from Wilderson in the book, it basically talks about black talk, and anti-racist talk more generally, as being coerced talk. In other words, the response that you get from institutions is, don't come to us with any bad news about race, don't come to us with any bad news about racism, unless you have a solution built in. And therefore you get a very, very constrained kind of anti-racist talk, and you get a kind of anti-racist talk that is steered towards kind of facile solutions, and again towards what Bell termed contradiction closure, the idea that, if we implement a new committee here, or apply a new monitoring form there, well, that'll be the end of it, or that we'll have dealt with racism.
Move on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Just move on. Stop talking about it. And I think it's a really important quote that kind of informs the whole book, really. That this wasn't a book that was written to. I think even some people who use aspects of critical race theory and claim to be working with critical race theory, they'll talk about Bell's work and Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and they'll talk about these big ideas, racial realism and interest convergence and contradiction closure, all these very difficult ideas. And then they'll feel kind of obligated to kind of, in the last few paragraphs of their article or chapter, they'll feel kind of obligated to sort of come up with two or three quite facile recommendations as to what we should do to and it's, I guess, what critical race theory is doing, and I think what I'd like people to take away from the book. First of all, it's the problems are sadly much bigger than that. It doesn't mean that there's no point at all in applying certain kinds of policy measures in particular areas, but the actual problem, the persistent problem of racism and racial injustice, it's really one that we have to take seriously, and to take it seriously it's a very uncomfortable process. And again, we can go back to Frantz Fanon, or for that matter, W.E.B. Du Bois and so forth. And what those great Black Atlantic thinkers are saying to us is well, there really would need to be a wholesale change in society to actually address and to begin to overcome the problems of racism
and with that notion of overcoming, that was a question I really did want to ask you, which is about how these concepts then play into so permanent racism, more broadly the study of critical race theory. How does that affect social change and activism, without trying to be the person that sat here saying, how did we move past here, Paul?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, at heart, what critical race theory really is, it's a theory of institutional racism. Yeah. So it's really concerned with how our great institutions, state institutions and state-aligned institutions, reproduce racism, reproduce racial inequality, reproduce racial injustice. And therefore, what it does is to begin to analyze that reproduction of injustice by really calling into question the claims to neutrality and meritocracy that dominate our institutions today. So what critical race theory does is to say, well, we cannot take at face value the education system or the legal system or the health system or whatever. We can't take their claims to be neutral institutions, and we have to look at the ways and work out the ways in which they are not neutral. So, our education system isn't neutral, our legal systems aren't neutral, but also the kind of parallel discourses that institutions throw up, where they would tell us what good law is, or what good policy is, or what good education is. Also, these ideas about what is good education, what is a just law, these things are also not neutral. So what critical race theory does is it can really embolden us to actually refuse to accept our institutions as being neutral when it comes to race and racism. Secondly, what it can really, I think, encourage us to do is to constantly refuse that dynamic of contradiction closure, where institutions can say to us, well, actually, we dealt with we dealt with those, we dealt with the old racism. That's done. We introduced a new policy, and it's all done with. So there's a kind of refusal of contradiction closure. And again, I guess what Bell says, and this is where Bell's work does come very much out of the civil rights struggle, because I've heard people who criticize critical race theory and say, no, we don't believe any of that. We hold fast to the principles of Martin Luther King, and they haven't got a clue what Martin Luther King was actually about. They're not interested in Martin Luther King in the sense that he brought thousands of people out on the street, that he confronted racist policing, that he called for reparations, that he was a very, very, very unpopular figure in the USA, a very divisive figure, more divisive than critical race theory ever could be. But no, critical race theory actually comes in very large part out of that civil rights struggle. That's what people like Derek Bell had actually grown up. And one of the things that Bell takes from the civil rights struggle, again, is that working on the basis that racism is a permanent feature of our societies doesn't actually paralyze us. Shouldn't actually paralyze us. And it doesn't let us off the hook. It actually says that no, once you understand that permanence, that actually is your incentive to go on and on and on working, and combating racism, combating social injustice. So, I remember seeing a comment on Martin Luther King the other day, which said that one of the reasons that King was such a challenging leader to his followers was that we often think of him as promising that we shall overcome, but actually what King also promised was tribulation. That really, there isn't going to be any easy way around racism. The only way you can confront racism and possibly move past it is to actually go through it, and that will require tribulation. It will require difficulty. It will require frustration. And critical race theory, when Bell talks about the permanence of racism, he says, the permanence of racism doesn't mean that we don't act. It means that we have to act, but we don't act on the basis of assuming that our actions will lead to a kind of easy, facile solution. And I suppose the final thing that I'd like people to take away from the book, again, does go back to that quote by Frederick Wilderson about the coercion of Black and, by extension, anti-racist speech, this idea that you shouldn't come to us talking about racism unless you've got a solution built in, because what Wilderson is really saying is, well, no, one of the first things that we have to do is to speak freely, and there's a lot of talk today about free speech, but I find very little talk about racism that is really freely voiced. There's still a lot of coercion, a lot of intimidation, a lot of anti-racist rhetoric. So what the book says is well, look, even if you don't have a neat solution, it's still necessary to speak up.
And eyes and ears and being aware and speaking to it. Yeah. And as I said, what critical race theory does also is to give us some pointers as to the kind of things to keep our eyes and ears open for: contradiction closure and interest convergence and all of this stuff. That has been really wonderful. Thank you so much.
I hope so. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope it made some sense of what the book and this whole permanent racism idea is about, Rebecca.
And I think I think it's great. And I think one of the things that you talked to at the beginning is this notion that the title, in some senses, has a shock value to it, but that's intentional. We need to be, in some senses, shocked into a recognition of having to get into dialogue with this term, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Paul's book, Permanent Racism, Race, Class and the Myth of Post-Racial Britain, is a brilliant foray into understanding how racism plays out in Britain in our immediate as well as more distant past, in our present and almost certainly in our future. Paul Warmington uses critical race theory and Black Atlantic thought to illuminate how post-racial discourse is routinely used to silence, erase and normalise social inequalities experienced by Black and Brown people. Whilst the book carries a tough message, it does so with purpose, calling for us to recognise that racism is durable, but not eternal, and that our choosing to acknowledge the situation as it is lived and experienced is a powerful and necessary first step.